When people talk about Apple nowadays, one of the things that comes up most often is the ecosystem, and it makes sense. Between computers, phones, tablets, speakers, and headphones, the Apple ecosystem today is massive and very tightly knit. But for this video, I want to wind the clock back over 20 years. I want to go back to the year 2000 and see what the Apple ecosystem looked like back then. So let's have a look. In the late 90s, when Steve Jobs returned to Apple, he reduced the convoluted product lineup that had just been spiraling out of control up to that point down to 4 squares. 2 product categories, Pro and Consumer, and 2 product types, desktop and laptop. Now for this video, there's a couple reasons why I chose to look at Apple's ecosystem from the year 2000. One of them was because it was the turn of the century, so we didn't have any Y2K marketing or anything like that. Another reason was because this was just before Apple introduced the iPod and well before they introduced the iPhone, so there weren't too many product categories, but this was the first year that Apple had expanded their 4-square product category, and they were also selling a Wi-Fi accessory, which we'll talk about in a little bit. To kick this off, we're going to start out in the consumer desktop category of Apple's 4-square product lineup, and we're going to take a look at the consumer desktop that saved Apple, the iMac. Introduced back in 1998, this all-in-one was a huge success for Apple. It looked like nothing else on the market until eMachine tried to rip it off and got sued, and its PowerBook G3 CPU meant that it led in performance compared to the equivalent Intel Pentium systems of the era. But the iMac G3 models that came out in the summer of 2000 actually carried over the redesign from 1999, including a slot-loaded disk drive, an even more translucent design than the original 1998 iMac, and some new colors. This was also the year that Apple dropped the starting price of the iMac from $999 to $799. The configuration you got with that base price was a 350 MHz G3 processor, 64 megabytes of RAM, and a 7 GB hard drive. The top spec, however, would run you about $1,500 for the DVSE model. This included a 500 MHz CPU, 1 GB of RAM, Wi-Fi, and up to 30 GB of storage, partnered with a DVD-ROM drive. For the best consumer Mac desktop at the turn of the century, this iMac was definitely the way to go. But what if you wanted something a bit more portable? Well, let's go ahead and move down a square and take a look at the iBook. Introduced back in 1999, the iBook was touted as the iMac to go, with a similar translucent and curvy design language taken from its desktop counterpart, as well as a handle, which was taken from its desktop counterpart. Aside from its inspired and very unique design, though, the iBook also holds the distinction of being the first mainstream computer designed and sold with Wi-Fi. Which what that actually meant was that it had all of the antennas and hardware to pick up Wi-Fi, minus the Apple Airport card, which you could buy separately, or you could, if you bought it online, which was very uncommon back then, install a Wi-Fi card from the factory. Kind of weird. The iBook didn't see much change from 1999 to 2000. The most notable change was the introduction of the iBook SE. It came in this graphite color, but blueberry and tangerine were also still available on the standard models. The SE also came with a faster G3 processor at 366 MHz. It had more RAM at 64 megabytes, which was also expandable to 320 by Apple or 576 by third parties, the latest macOS 9, and an 8 GB hard drive as standard. Everything else, however, was exactly the same. Same Wi-Fi options, same 800 by 600 12-inch display, and the same 45 watt-hour battery, which for the time was very impressive, especially considering the watt-hours that were coming out on the Pro laptop that we'll take a look at here in a little bit. So just like the marketing said, this was pretty much an iMac to go for anybody who wanted to have a portable experience that was indistinguishable from the iMac desktop experience. Now, before we move over to Apple's Pro lineup, I do want to talk about one product that, in my opinion, is the reason why the iBook's Wi-Fi was such a success, and also why the first introduction for a lot of Apple users to Wi-Fi was so easy, and that is the Airport Base Station. This airport router was introduced back in 1999 alongside the iBook, and this little blob router was a lot of early adopters' first experience with Wi-Fi. And of course, by today's standards, it's incredibly bad, but for the year 2000, this thing was cutting edge. This router came with 802.11b Wi-Fi, which was pretty new for the time, as well as 2 Ethernet ports, a single USB port for the newly introduced at the time USB-capable printers, and it even came with a 56K modem, so you could take this thing online without needing a separate modem to do so. This thing really was, in my opinion, the kickstart that a lot of router manufacturers needed, because at the time, Wi-Fi wasn't really a thing, and then Apple made it much more approachable for the average user, so other companies thought maybe they could do the same. And 25 years on, some of them still haven't figured out how to make a decent application to manage your Wi-Fi. I'm looking at you, Netgear. But for me personally, my favorite feature of these airport routers is actually something that every airport router had right up until Apple discontinued them, which was the ability to wirelessly connect them together to make your range better. These routers, even the original from 25 years ago, had the ability to handle mesh networking. There are routers nowadays that can't even do mesh networking, and you have to use some crap little range extender, but these were able to communicate with one another seamlessly to make one large network, all the way back in 1999 and 2000 with this first generation. Wild. In terms of pricing, the airport router was $299, which was pretty expensive for the time, but you have to remember that Wi-Fi itself came out in 1997, and Apple was introducing a router with mesh capabilities, USB, Ethernet, the whole 9 yards, 3 years later. So yeah, I think it was worth the price if you were an early adopter. So now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and move to the Pro side of Apple's product lineup, and we're going to stick with laptops for now. Apple's Pro laptop offering at the time was the PowerBook G3, and this PowerBook G3 was actually still using the same design that had only been slightly changed since 1998. It looked almost identical to its 1999 bronze keyboard predecessor, but this laptop did sport a few differences on the outside and under the hood. First and foremost, this PowerBook sported 2 FireWire ports that allowed video professionals to move files much more quickly. And secondly, it sported a faster 500 MHz PowerPC G3 with a higher RAM ceiling of 1 GB. Lastly, this model of the PowerBook G3 could be optioned with up to a 20 GB hard drive, as well as 802.11b Wi-Fi and a 6 or 8x DVD-ROM drive. As for the things that carried over from the previous generation, it sported the same 14-inch 1024x768 display, a 50 watt-hour battery that was swappable, as well as macOS 9 and a $3,500 price tag for that top trim model. Now that is a pretty expensive laptop, and even at the starting price of $2,500, this Pismo PowerBook really did pull out all of the stops for what would be considered a professional laptop of the era. And believe it or not, this PowerBook was actually good enough to keep up with macOS until 10.4.11. That came out in 2007, which for reference was only about 2 years before Apple completely dropped support for PowerPC in general. So pretty sure for the people who spent that $3,500 or hell, even the starting $2,500 for this PowerBook, they were very happy with the longevity. But speaking of things that keep pros happy, now we're going to move to the product category that pretty much seemed to only exist during this era to make pros happy. And that is the Pro desktop lineup, specifically the PowerMac G4. Coming off the heels of the PowerMac G3, the G4 was essentially what every professional wanted in an upgrade. More power, similar form factor, and the same price. Now, the PowerMac G4 was introduced in 1999, but it did get a refresh in 2000, introducing several firsts for the PowerMac lineup, including gigabit Ethernet, an optional zip drive, Apple's ADC port for the recently introduced Apple Cinema display, and dual 450 or 500 megahertz CPUs within one system. Now, for me personally, my favorite version of the PowerMac G4 was the G4 Quicksilver, which is what I'm using to show off the internals because there's only a few changes and you get the idea. But this, for right now, is the 2000s model, which still carries over the same design as the 1999 version. Other upgrades included more storage at up to 40 gigabytes, 2 gigabytes of RAM, which was double the PowerMac G3's, 802.11b Wi-Fi support, 3 PCI card slots, and an AGP slot that could be loaded with a 16 megabyte ATI Rage Pro or a 32 megabyte ATI Radeon graphics card. Also, the ATI Radeon graphics card could handle 2 displays at once. Wow. Honestly, that was actually pretty impressive for the time. The starting price for the PowerMac G4 was $1,600, which was the same starting price as the PowerMac G3, but if you wanted a top trim model, you could spend upwards of $3,500. And you all say Apple is pricey nowadays. For context, that's about $6,500 adjusted for inflation. You could almost buy a Mac Pro for that, but yeah, buying a Mac Pro nowadays doesn't really make a lot of sense, whereas buying a PowerBook G3 back then made a lot of sense for professionals. But speaking of not making a lot of sense, remember when I mentioned how Apple expanded their product line for the first time in the year 2000? Let's go talk about that Mac now. The Mac that Apple chose to expand their product line for is my personal favorite Mac, and also the Mac that, even to this day, does not make any sense for pros or consumers. It was the PowerBook G3 Cube. This Mac is so cool and so confusing. Steve Jobs kind of had an obsession with computers being cubes. Just look at the Next computers, for example. It's a cube. He also absolutely hated fans and fan noise. So what happens when you want to make something that's pro-focused, but you also want to make it a fanless cube? Well, you end up with this, a very cool, very niche, and very limited box that is too expensive for the average consumer and limited for most professionals. Now, when the G4 Cube was introduced, it stunned the audience. It had a toaster-style disk drive, a capacitive power button, it looked like it was floating in acrylic, and it opened like this. Like, oh my god, this thing is so freaking cool. Then they revealed the specs and the price. There were no options to have dual power PC G4s because of the cooling constraints, only one AGP slot for upgrading the graphics, no PCI card slots, and 512 megabytes less RAM capacity than its bigger brother. Okay, well, I mean, as long as those compromises mean that the computer is less expensive, then I could potentially see somebody being interested in it. Oh, it started at $1,800. $200 more than the more expandable and more powerful normal PowerBook G3 for a significantly smaller machine that also had less expansion, less power, and yes, technically less size. For all intents and purposes, this thing was an absolute flop. I mean, it was a really cool idea, but it was definitely ahead of its time. We did end up seeing it kind of get reincarnated with the Mac Mini and eventually the Mac Studio, but for the year 2000, the G4 was a cool but unnecessary addition to the Pro line that ended up getting cannibalized by its bigger brother, the PowerBook G3. And aside from a few displays like the Cinema display and the LCD and CRT Studio displays, that is every single one of Apple's major products from the year 2000. Taking a look back at what Apple was doing at the turn of the century, one thing becomes very clear, and that is that they were hungry for success. I mean, they had only just barely been saved from bankruptcy a few years ago, and they were still trying to regain their footing in the market. But aside from the G4 Cube, they were laser focused on making good computers for consumers and pros, and that was it. The iPod wasn't even going to be announced for another year, and the iPhone was 7 years away. But nowadays in 2025, with every Apple product being interconnected, synced, and closed off behind this very well-established walled garden that Apple's known for, it's kind of nice to look back at a time when the Apple ecosystem was literally just tied together by the Apple logo on the top, side, or back of whatever computer you happen to own. But either way, that's been it. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I really do hope you enjoyed it. I love kind of going over tech history just because it's really cool to see where we are now and where things started, especially with companies that have such a weird past like Apple or Microsoft with the Xbox and stuff like that. So hopefully you enjoyed it. And if you did, maybe leave a like, maybe subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I got a bunch of stuff going, and maybe check out some other videos. This Nintendo one is pretty popular right now. But either way, that's been it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Make sure to be there, and have a good one.